Summary of Imagined Communities by Benedict Anderson. Imagined Communities, Benedict Anderson's groundbreaking study of nationalism, starts by rejecting the idea that states are a natural or necessary way for people to live together. Instead, Anderson says that the country is a cultural creation with a past that includes the fall of monarchs and powers as well as specific changes in literacy, technology, and capitalism. Anderson says that the similarities between nations that grew up in different times and places, which he says are often the result of countries just copying each other, can help us figure out what nations are really about and how much power they seem to have over their people. But he also looks at the big differences between nations, both when they were formed and now, to show how they are shaped by history and how they keep many of the structures, tendencies, and inequalities that were part of the social and political systems they replaced. In his opening, Anderson gives a case study to show what is different about nationalism. Vietnam attacked Cambodia in 1978 and 1979, and then China invaded Vietnam. This is surprising because all three countries were Marxist, which meant that their foreign goals were the same and they should have fought together, not against each other, in wars. But these countries put their nationalist ideas ahead of their Marxist ones, letting old grudges and ideas about racial identity get in the way of their long-term political goals. This shows that nationalism is different from other political isms because no one would die for the idea of democracy, but every year, thousands of people die for their countries. The idea of a country is so strong that everyone thinks everyone else is part of one. The United Nations is the most important foreign political body, and since World War II, every successful revolution has defined itself in national terms. Anderson says that no one really knows or agrees on what nation, nationality, and nationalism mean, and the more experts try to explain or justify nationalism, the less sense it seems to make. When someone gives their life for their country, why do they do it? Anderson says it is for an idea. Countries are not physical things, but rather emotional and spiritual ones. Anderson says that a country is an imagined political community that is thought of as both limited and independent. Like any group bigger than a small town, a country is imagined because most of its people will never meet each other in person. However, they see themselves as part of a political community that is like a family, with common roots, interests, and a deep, horizontal comradeship. People think that a country has clear borders, limited, and that it is the only legal power, sovereign, within those borders. In his next part, Cultural Roots, Anderson says that one of the most important things nationalism does is give meaning to things that don't have it, like when someone dies in war. After the Enlightenment, when religion became less important and lost its political role, nationalism stepped in to give meaning to people's efforts to get better, serve their rulers, and even die. People of different religions started meeting each other after the Middle Ages. Vernacular languages started replacing holy ones in writing, and people stopped thinking of history as God's will and more as a chain of causes and effects. Anderson calls this new idea homogeneous, empty time. Anderson looks at a few examples of nationalist stories written in the vernacular to show how they start to show a community of citizens living in a bounded territory entity. He then looks at the newspaper as a cultural product to show how it creates an imagined community out of its readers. In the next chapter, The Origins of National Consciousness, Anderson digs deeper into the role of printed texts that were spread in increasingly easy-to-understand languages to a growing number of people. He calls this print capitalism. He says that the Protestant Reformation was an important early factor that helped dethrone Latin as Europe's shared language for politics and scholarship. Then, Anderson shows how print capitalism helped to standardize languages. For example, companies decided to print in a standard dialect that everyone could understand. These standard forms became prestige versions of languages, and because they were now written down, they changed much less than spoken languages did over time. In his fourth part, Anderson talks about the first nationalist movements, which were in the Americas, not in Europe, and were led by the elite Creole classes, not by the disenfranchised people. Because the colonial elite spoke the same languages as their European imperial rulers and had easy access to European Enlightenment philosophy, they were able to easily rebel and create democratic republics in the New World instead of recreating the European monarchies that hurt them economically and culturally. In the second part of this chapter, Anderson tries to explain how big nationalist movements were. For example, why did the United States become one big country while the Spanish kingdom broke up into more than a dozen smaller countries? When it came to geography, the British colonies were clustered together, and their businesses and media markets were closely linked. On the other hand, the Spanish colonies were much more spread out. Also, in the Spanish Empire, officials who were born in a colony could only work in the closest colonial city. They could never pilgrimage all the way to Madrid. Because of how the government was set up and where it was, each major Spanish colonial region developed its own economy, media system, and sense of national identity. Each then started its own revolution to become its own country. In the next part, Old Languages, New Models, Anderson talks about the next 100 years, from about 1820 to 1920, when monarchies in Europe started to be replaced by nationalist states. Again, language was very important. The reading classes of each major European language started to think of themselves as a community. They also grew quickly because of the growth of government offices and a new bourgeoisie class, both of which needed members to be educated. But Anderson also brings up a new reason for nationalism, the fact that Europeans could copy their American peers, who had already rebelled and built countries. This is what Anderson calls piracy. In the sixth part, Official Imperialism and Nationalism, Anderson looks at how established states and powers started using nationalist ideas to stop populist rebels. He gives a number of examples of official nationalism, such as how the Russian and British empires forced their national languages on people who didn't speak those languages. He also talks about how Thailand copied the diplomatic and building projects of European empires in an attempt to keep from being attacked by those empires, but failed. In his seventh part, Anderson talks about the last wave of nationalisms, which started after World War II in Africa and Asia, especially in countries that rebelled against European rule. The people who lived in these areas could take part in government and make pilgrimages to Europe more easily because of new technology and the growth of bureaucracy. Most of them were young and idealistic, and they became great rebels by copying the tactics of nationalists from other continents and making their countries different from the European countries that had conquered them, but still using European languages. There were still differences between these countries, though. For example, the huge and diverse archipelago of Indonesia, which was colonized by the Dutch but ruled indirectly by them, became a single country after World War II, thanks in large part to the spread of Standard Malay, now called Bahasa Indonesia, and the centralization of higher education in a few universities in Western Java. In West Africa and Indochina, on the other hand, the French built schools in smaller towns and pitted different ethnic groups against each other. This led to the breakup of these areas into many smaller countries. Anderson's eighth chapter asks why people feel so strongly about their countries that they are willing to die for them. Many experts have pointed out that nationalism and racism often go hand in hand. However, nationalism can also lead to profoundly self-sacrificing love, which is like the love people have for their families. Anderson says that nationalism is always open to new people joining the country, such as by learning the language and becoming a citizen, while racism dreams of eternal contaminations and has been used as a tool of oppression by powerful people everywhere and throughout history. So, he comes to the conclusion that racism is not caused or led by nationalism, even though racists can use nationalistic words. Anderson talks about the role of copying and piracy in the history of nationalism in the 9th chapter, which was the planned ending of imagined communities. In the introduction, he used China, Vietnam, and Cambodia as an example of a country that copied bad examples of official nationalism and Marxist change. Since it is clear that nationalism is more important to these countries than the political ideologies they claim to follow, Anderson thinks that experts should stop putting Marxist theory before the facts and start preparing for more inter-socialist wars. In the updated version of the book, Anderson added the last 2 chapters to make his points stronger. Chapter 10 looks at the census, map, and museum, 3 colonial institutions that Anderson thinks made it possible for post-World War II rebels in Southeast Asia, where he is an expert, to think of their lands as countries. Colonial surveys and maps used systematic quantification to split people and land into totalizing classification systems. Maps and museums also made logos and symbols of national identity, making live history into a set of dead objects. In Chapter 11, the role of past in a country's story of itself is looked at. The First Nations looked to the future and thought they were making history, but the generation that came after them, 1815 to 1850, said that their nations were waking up from sleep because their people were realizing a long-standing, old, primordial unity. With the shift to uniform, empty time, the new academic field of history became a key way for nations to define the deep ties that bound their people, especially by choosing what to remember and what to forget, or what to include and leave out of national identity stories.
About the author. Benedict Anderson was born in China. His father is an Irishman, worked as a customs office, and her mother is English. He grew up in China, Ireland, and the United States. He went to the University of Cambridge in England to study classics and graduated in 1957. He then went back to the United States to get his PhD at Cornell. In 1967, he finished his paper, which was about Indonesian nationalist politics. As a graduate student, he published the so-called Cornell paper, in which he and fellow graduate students Ruth McVeigh and Frederick Bonnell challenged the Indonesian government's claim that an attempted coup d'etat, government overthrow, in 1966 was a communist plot. This claim led to the deaths of at least 500,000 people who were accused of being communists. As a result of the coup and killings, Indonesia's political order was thrown into chaos, and President Suharto took control of the country for a long time. After the Cornell paper was leaked to the public and Anderson appeared in court to support an Indonesian communist leader, he was banned from Indonesia for the more than 30 years that Suharto was in charge, until 1998, when his first trip back became a big public event. Anderson then turned his attention to Thailand and the Philippines for his study, but he was still a well-known expert on Indonesia and even ran the academic magazine Indonesia for nearly 20 years. Anderson taught at Cornell from 1965 to 2002. In 1988, he was named the Aaron L. Beinenkorb Professor Emeritus of International Studies, Government, and Asian Studies there. Anderson has won many awards for all of his work, but Imagined Communities is by far the most famous. It is still seen as the most important study of nationalism. The book is still controversial in the academic world, which is very focused on Europe, because it says that nationalism started in the Americas, not in Europe. Anderson retired in 2002 and spent most of the rest of his life in Southeast Asia. He died in 2015 in Eastern Java, Indonesia.
Hope we summarized it fully and you liked it. Please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so that we are motivated to create more videos.